Ip Man was not an unbeatable kung fu hero. His true story is both darker and more fascinating than the legend. This video separates the real Ip Man from the myths surrounding him, including the often misunderstood nature of his relationship with Bruce Lee. So stick around and let's dive in. Ip Man's training in Wing Chun began at age 11 in his hometown of Foshan. He trained under Chan Shun, often nicknamed Money Changer Wa, due to the high fees he charged and the small number of students he accepted. In interviews, Ip Man stated that the admission red packet his parents had to provide included 11 taels of silver, an extraordinary amount of money for the time. By the time Ip Man enrolled in training with Chan Shun, his teacher was already old and in failing health. So much of Ip Man's instruction came from senior students in the school, and his first teacher died when Ip Man was just 16 years old. Shortly afterwards, Ip Man moved to Hong Kong to attend St. Stephen's College. Ip Man was already confident with his kung fu abilities, and some even say he liked to show off a little about it. So naturally he accepted when an older master challenged him to a friendly sparring exchange. Unfortunately, Ip Man was beaten decisively. That man was Leung Bik, a disciple of Leung Jan, who was actually the teacher of Ip Man's previous master. Leung Bik praised Ip Man's ability and agreed to train him, and under Leung Bik's guidance, Ip Man refined the principles of Wing Chun, which would later go deep into developing his own personal take on the style. In the early 1920s, Ip Man returned to Foshan as a skilled Wing Chun practitioner. He married, had 4 children while working as a police officer for the nationalist government, and while doing so, Ip Man taught Wing Chun briefly in private circles. And interestingly, there are actually some accounts of him sparring in friendly matches with local masters, and even the scene we see in the Ip Man movies of the Northerners coming to Foshan and challenging the different masters did happen. However, it's unclear just how much these events involved Ip Man himself. Popular portrayals of Ip Man's life story place him at the centre of wartime resistance against Japanese occupation, including public confrontations, humiliating the foreign occupiers and defending Chinese pride and their martial arts through combat. The historical record, however, is far more restrained. During the Japanese occupation of Foshan, Ip Man and his family did remain there for some time, and much like everyone else, did suffer from poverty and starvation. And there are also credible accounts that state that the Japanese did try to recruit Ip Man at some point to teach Chinese kung fu. However, this was likely because of Ip Man's education, social standing and reputation as a martial artist, rather than them having observed him winning a duel. But what we certainly do not see, however, was Ip Man fighting against the Japanese soldiers themselves. Certainly not in some kind of massive public spectacle where he was taking on high-ranking Japanese officials. Crucially, Ip Man did not flee China because of Japanese occupation. He left in 1949, years after the Sino-Japanese War had ended, following the communist victory in the Chinese Civil War. As we know, Ip Man had previously worked as a police officer for the nationalist government, and in this new political era, this would have put him at serious risk, particularly as someone well educated and knowledgeable in fighting and combat. And while many of Foshan's martial artists remained in mainland China, Ip Man chose exile. So his move to Hong Kong was not a symbolic act of heroic resistance, it was one of political motivation, but more importantly, physical survival. When Ip Man arrived in Hong Kong, he was a refugee in his mid-50s. He had no stable income, no institutional support, and little social capital. For Ip Man, teaching Wing Chun in Hong Kong wasn't a cultural mission, it was a financial necessity. However, this period also coincided with some serious personal struggles. Multiple sources confirm that Ip Man was a regular opium user and addict, and of course that would have been an expensive habit, but it's important to understand the context here. Opium use was still both financially draining and extremely destructive, however it wasn't viewed with the same stigma then as it is today. Some historians suggest that founding the Wing Chun Athletic Association in Hong Kong helped stabilise Ip Man's life somewhat, providing income and structure during what was a difficult transition period. And there are also records of closed-door duels taking place within the Hong Kong martial arts teaching scene. However, it's unlikely that Ip Man faced this passage of initiation as we see taking place in many of the movies. One of the most tragic aspects of Ip Man's life is an event which is often ignored in his biographies. When he fled to Hong Kong, Ip Man, his wife and his eldest daughter accompanied him, while his other 3 children stayed back in Foshan to finish their education. However, when his wife and daughter returned to Foshan to collect identity documents, they were met by a tragic twist of fate. Before they could rejoin him, the border between mainland China and Hong Kong was closed, cutting Ip Man off from his wife and family. Unfortunately, Ip Man and his wife were never reunited. She returned to Foshan and later died of cancer in 1960. Years later, in Hong Kong, Ip Man began a relationship with a local woman and fathered an illegitimate son. Then in the early 60s, when Ip Man's children finally joined him in Hong Kong, they found he had already started a new family. This stands in stark contrast to the image painted of Ip Man as the patriarch family man that we see in many biographies. And sadly, his family was permanently fractured by border disputes, politics, and personal decisions. Of all Ip Man's students, the most famous without a doubt is Bruce Lee. However, the nature of their relationship is often misunderstood. In particular, Bruce Lee's background caused problems. Bruce Lee's mother was actually of mixed Eurasian descent. Meanwhile, his father was a Cantonese opera performer who spent a lot of time overseas. And in mid-20th century Hong Kong, Chinese martial arts were often closely guarded by social and cultural barriers. There are several accounts that strongly suggest that Ip Man was initially reluctant to teach Bruce Lee because of his mixed heritage. Whether this came from Ip Man himself or social pressure from Ip Man's senior students is unclear. What is known, however, is that a mutual friend put in a good word for Bruce Lee, and eventually Ip Man agreed to take him on. While Ip Man was Bruce Lee's formal teacher, a lot of Bruce's day-to-day instruction came from senior students of the school rather than Ip Man himself. Lee was obviously immensely talented at martial arts, but he was also rebellious and somewhat abrasive in his youth, and he left for the United States before formally completing his Wing Chun training or reaching a rank of an instructor or teacher in his own right. Years later, after Lee had become an international star, he returned to Hong Kong. Lee reportedly offered to buy Ip Man an apartment in exchange for allowing him to film the Wing Chun routines and positions that Ip Man had refined over his career. But Ip Man declined, finding the offer undignified or inappropriate. However, this did have a flip side, because weeks before his death, Ip Man agreed to be filmed, creating a series of recordings that would influence Wing Chun practitioners throughout the world for generations to come. His eldest son, Ip Chun, recorded the footage that we see of Ip Man practicing Wing Chun today. So we can see that Bruce Lee and Ip Man certainly would have had a complicated relationship at points. It wasn't one shaped by bitterness or betrayal, it was simply the meeting of two different worlds, one rooted in tradition and survival, and one destined to challenge everything we knew about martial arts entirely. So there we go. While the films and biographies of Ip Man's life present him as an infallible hero of Chinese Kung Fu, the reality is very different but almost more impressive, and as a result Wing Chun has prospered globally, becoming one of the most dominant martial arts styles in the entire world. If you enjoyed this video, check out this one up here about the history of Wing Chun, everything from the Southern Shaolin Temple to the opera troupes who helped shape Wing Chun. I think you'll enjoy it. Until next time, train hard, stay safe, thanks for watching.